everyone. Welcome to Two Wings of the Same Bird, Puerto Rico and Cuba, two different responses to natural disaster. My name is Jason Ortiz. I'm the president of the Connecticut Puerto Rican Agenda, which is a statewide organization that seeks to mobilize Puerto Ricans throughout the country, specifically here in Connecticut, but all over the world, towards justice for Puerto Rico. And so we wanted to be...
Hi.
My name's J.C. McCauley.
I'm Naisha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
All over the world towards justice for Puerto Rico. And so we wanted to make sure that we started to discuss Puerto Rico not just in the confines of just its own island, but its relationship to the other Caribbean nations and the United States. And so, welcome. And so we've had, a number of conversations about the hurricane and what it meant to Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. And so we wanted to actually delve into that a little bit deeper. Myself, I was here with Councilwoman Bermudez, who was someone that was helping with the families that were displaced and came to Hartford. And so we saw very clearly the impact that the hurricane was having directly here in Hartford and here in Connecticut. And so we wanted to make sure we continued that conversation because, as we all know, or many of us in this room know, that the disaster was just as man-made as it was natural disaster, right? Like, we had a lot of political decisions and different things that led to the crisis being so dire and the response afterwards being so inept and insufficient. And so we wanted to explore how other countries also deal with these problems, and then open it up for folks to have any time that you would like to ask questions about the different systems in place and how we can move forward to make sure that Puerto Rico gets everything that it needs moving forward. But first, we have Sammy Vega from the Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade here in Hartford to tell us a little bit about the work that they're doing and some of the ways folks here can get involved in things moving forward. And so the parade has been super helpful and was instrumental in providing support services for the folks that were displaced and helping to raise funds to make sure they had the basic needs that they needed. So I just want to say thank you to Sammy for all of his work across the years that he's been working with our communities. Take it away, Sammy.
Good evening. Thank you, Jason. First of all, I want to the guest speakers today. I want to thank you for being here today. I want to like to congratulate you guys and look forward for hearing about Cuba. Regarding, and also I want to thank our sponsors regarding the one that helped put this thing together. The Desfile Puerto Rican in Hartford, Connecticut Puerto Rican Agenda, the Greater Hartford Coalition of Cuba, and of course, for having this space here today, the church, Our Lady of Sorrow Catholic Church. Thank you for having us here today. A little bit about CICD Puerto Rican Parade. As you know, back in 2007, Hurricane Maria hit our island very hard, and to this day, they're still fighting, but our community, City of Hartford, the Desfile Puerto Riqueño, we partnered with many organizations during 2007, and unfortunately, we decided as a committee to postpone the Desfile Puerto Riqueño, the Puerto Rican Parade, 2007, due to the Hurricane Maria, and also for other reasons too. But luckily, in 2007, we concentrate to see how we can help our island, and we partner with many organizations like Daddy Yankee, reggaeton artists, Hispanic Federation, the City of Hartford, and also with Alice Bermudez that helped closely the families. The Crack Relief Center, Aura Alvarado, and Los Amigos Softball League. Talking about Los Amigos Softball League, they worked very hard, and they collected, I think they filled approximately a warehouse of items, And unfortunately, due to restrictions of sending stuff to Puerto Rico, it took us basically about 6-7 months just to bring the relief effort, like water, supplies, due to restrictions and issues. But that's something I would love to hear too today. I'm looking forward to see how, because I know Cuba got hit with the same hurricane, I believe. And, Ilma, yes. And I hear that they were active in 2 weeks, and it took Puerto Rico more than a year, and again, it's still suffering, So I want to hear how Cuba made it in 2 weeks, how they did the work. And also briefly, as you know, I want to announce a few dates for the Maria Sanchez banquet, a banquet that we support, give out scholarship, and also give out awards to leaders in the community. It's happening March 30th. If you have nothing to do, please mark your calendar. Also, Miss Puerto Rico of Hartford is happening May 25th. And our annual parade and Festival del Conquí will be happening June 2nd. Hopefully I will see you guys there. And thank you for having me here
All right, well, I'm going to let our panelists give themselves their longer introductions, but I just want to introduce them briefly. We're going to start with Dr. Torre, who is a resident of New Haven and has done a significant amount of work on Puerto Rican issues and Hispanic issues more generally, and has also been a big supporter of the agenda. He was there for our first assembly when we were getting things moving. So we always appreciate Dr. Torre, who can provide some context to what we're going to be talking about. We'll have Agnes Torre, who is a resident of Hartford and someone who was also displaced by the hurricane and came here to Hartford after the hurricane and currently works with Councilwoman Wodalis Bermudez, helping the families and all the members of Hartford make sure that they get what they need moving forward also, and was a student at the University of Puerto Rico. And then we have Ramon Espinoza, who is also a member of the agenda and actually traveled to Cuba multiple times to see how they handle things over there, and actually went, very recently to see what it was like after the hurricane. And so he's going to be sharing a bit of his experiences there. But we're going to start with Dr. Torre. He's going to provide a little context for us and then also give some current background on the differences of the two, as Agnes will focus on Puerto Rico and Ramon will focus on Cuba. And so if we could just get a round of applause for our speakers real quick. Thank you. And then we'll start with Dr. Torre.
Muchas gracias. I was just telling Agnes and Ramon, I don't even know what I'm dealing with here in the computer because it's too much to present, right? And I think we should keep it short, about 15 minutes at most. Hold the mic a little closer. Thank you. Oh, you can hear it. Mira que chévere. So, what I want to do is just present some bullet points. It's much too much. I've got here like volumes and stuff. And it would just be very confusing. And I have the tendency to go off on tangents. I have a deep, deep case of ADHD. And I can make all kinds of connections and be here all night. So I don't want to do that. I think I work better with questions. And so I'll make a fast presentation, put some context around it. And, at the end, once the three of us have presented, we can open up for questions. But what what you were saying, Sammy, what you just said, I just happen to have some statistics here. Within a couple of weeks of the hurricanes hitting Cuba first on September 9 and Puerto Rico on September 20th, within a couple of weeks, Puerto Rico was 95% without power, and more than half without drinking water, only 11% of cell phone towers working, etc. In the same amount of time, more or less, Cuba was 87% of the population affected was now with both electricity and water. Right? And supposedly here, Cuba is the third world country. Okay. So how does this all come to be? I don't know how much history you know about Puerto Rico and all of these kinds of things, but I guess everybody knows that in 1898, the United States wanted to go to war with with Spain. They were fine with Spain because Spain was moribunda, it was on its way out. So they didn't worry about that. But they were very scared of England. They didn't want, Spain to leave America and all of a sudden England to take over. England was then what the United States is now. It's the most powerful nation in the world, the richest, all of it. everything you can say about the United States today, well, you would have to say about England at the time. And so, whether it was purposeful or not, the Maine blew up and went to war. Puerto Rico had nothing to do with that. They weren't involved in that war. But then, U.S. asked for it as reparation for the work that they had done when all of the work against Spain had been done by Cuba. They had really kind of wiped out Spain. Cuba eventually gets a semi-independence, becomes a neo-colony, and Puerto Rico has stayed all of this time as a classical colony, a full colony. What does that mean? Cuba was under the thumb of the United States until Fidel Castro, took over. And at that point, everything was, all relationships were broken. And that's why you still have an embargo. What is it, almost 60 years after that incident? And the only one that's holding up the embargo is the United States. Now, something that I think you need to understand about Puerto Rico is that it has always been an unincorporated territory. And technically, the relationship, people say, does Puerto Rico belong to the United States? Well, I don't think so, but even the United States doesn't think so. Because the official definition of Puerto Rico is it belongs to, but it is not part of, right? So it's a strange situation when in the 1950s, in the 40s, the late 40s, and then the 50s, a lot of decolonization was taking place in Africa and other countries around the world that had been colonized, mostly by European powers. And the United States was under pressure to do something about Puerto Rico. So they came up with a new name, Commonwealth. Well, it's interesting because it was Estado Libre Asociado, translated as Free Associated State, but they didn't want that name. And I blame the Irish for that, right? Because at the time, England, the UK, had been having all kinds of problems with Ireland for hundreds of years that had held on to it. And finally, they had come up with a status that they called the Irish Free State. And Free Associated State sounded too much like the Irish Free State. And under the Irish Free State, you were having all kinds of issues still. Political issues, a lot of killings, a lot of terrorist things going on and that sort of thing. The United States didn't want that. So in English, they never translated it that way. But I think, the Puerto Rican people were wiser than a lot of us oftentimes give credit for. Because I still remember how people would describe Commonwealth was el mismo perro con distinto collar. The same dog with a different collar, right? It hasn't changed a bit. So you call it Commonwealth, you can call it whatever, you could call it Mars. It's still the same thing, it's still a total colony. Something that most people don't understand is that there is something that the U.S. Congress cannot do. It's prohibited from doing. Most people think, they can do whatever the hell they want, right? They're the 2,000-pound gorilla. But one of the things, among others, that the United States Congress cannot do is take sovereignty away from itself. So you can put it in the hands of somebody, but it is still your responsibility. So by calling Puerto Rico a Commonwealth, it didn't take anything away. It's still an unincorporated territory, a total colony. By allowing elections for a governor, still the same thing. There's no difference there. Just instead of the president appointing governors, well, now you guys can pick somebody. Not going to have much power anyway within the U.S. Body politic, so it doesn't really matter. And by allowing all kinds of other incentives that looked like Puerto Rico was not like the other unincorporated territories. And by the way, Puerto Rico has 10 times more population than the other, I believe it's four territories that the U.S. has combined. So it's a tiger's by the tail at the same time. And the United States has had a conundrum there because they're not quite sure how to get out of it. I could go into stories and stuff, but if anybody's interested, ask questions later, and I'll focus more on that. So when it hit the fan is right after the, ¿cómo se dice? The economic crisis that started in 2006, actually, and then 2007, and it really struck hard in 2008. Right? And there you see the actions. See, Puerto Rico had been included in the bankruptcy laws of the United States. And then suddenly, with no explanation, I've looked around, I've done research, people in Congress have done research. They haven't been able to come up with why is it that all of a sudden, I'm forgetting the guy's name, I'm tired a little tonight, but the senator, the U.S. senator who was like in his hundreds, I think he just died fairly recently, he all of a sudden just took Puerto Rico out of the bankruptcy clause of the United States. So Puerto Rico was left totally without any protection. And around 2006, 2007, the Puerto Rican government starts to see that it's in real trouble. What it decides to do is pass its own bankruptcy laws so that it can somehow take care of itself when something happens, because it was obvious it was going to happen. And the U.S. corporations went to the Supreme Court and got that law struck down, because essentially they wanted to be paid regardless of what the hardship was going to be to the Puerto Rican people. So they got that law struck down. And eventually you get Promesa, and you get all of the... See, they left the Puerto Rico government there, the shell. But Promesa is totally in control of Puerto Rico right now. And Promesa is under the Congress. So it is still a colony. So it doesn't... First of all, it had been weakened by a debt that was not of its own. Essentially, you had the 936, 936, which allowed, tax exemption for U.S. corporations coming to Puerto Rico. And then suddenly that was just taken away. So all of the wealth that had been built up and all of the jobs and that sort of thing just disappeared. This is when governors, and I'm not taking any blame away from Puerto Rican governors, right? But this is when they started racking up the debt. And the one that followed was bigger and bigger and bigger until you get to, what is it now? 79 billion, 80 billion at this point. All of that was just to keep up the appearances that Puerto Rico was still true to its name, Puerto Rico, right? And so Puerto Rico is unable to take care of itself. Right? And it doesn't have control over itself, so it can do nothing to try to figure out how do we come up with a socioeconomic plan that is good for the citizens and the residents of Puerto Rico. When the two hurricanes hit one after the other, it was totally devastated, and it had no way of recovering. On the other hand, Cuba had gone through a similar situation when the Soviet Union fell apart, but because they are an autonomous country, they are an independent country, they had at least some way of getting back. And I'm not saying they're rich, but they're rich in culture as we are, right? And the people of Cuba have been educated in the schools and so forth to immediately meter mano. Start to let's do this. And you saw that in Puerto Rico as well. I still remember, I think it was Hurricane Hugo. I went to Puerto Rico a month after Hugo, and I couldn't tell a hurricane had gone through it all, right? And it was mostly the people themselves, cleaning, removing tree trunks, fixing the houses, all of that. But in Puerto Rico, it came to the point where you could no longer do this. I mean, you didn't have the wherewithal. And more, in my estimate, about 1 million people have left Puerto Rico. What people are saying is several 100,000. And just yesterday, I saw finally somebody say 500,000. Well, Puerto Rico, before all of this, had over 4 million people. And today, they still talk about 3.5 million. Well, if that's true, then it's over 500,000. But I don't believe that the population is 3.5 million anymore. It's even lower than that. So I estimate that roughly about 1 million people have left. And who has left? The people with the most education, the people with the most skills, and that sort of thing, because they can get jobs over here almost immediately. That's going to have, I think, a positive impact on the United States and on Puerto Ricans in the United States eventually, but it is going to be devastating even more so for Puerto Rico itself. And unless we can start to do something to bring a lot of those people back in some kind of way, but how do we do it? We don't have control over ourselves. There are a number of villages and a number of towns that are starting to become self-sufficient and so forth. To some extent, it almost feels like a drop in the bucket. Right? I'm not sure that that is going to be enough. We have to do something much more radical than that, because otherwise we are totally out in the cold. They're going to say, "Is my time up?" Okay. So let me just leave that as background. And, you know, we'll pick it up later. Hopefully you'll have some questions around that area. Thank you.
So, hi, my name is Torre, and I came to Connecticut 1 year ago after the Hurricane Maria. And I did came because of the hurricane, but also because of the economic crisis that's hurting Puerto Rico. Mostly and caused by the U.S. government and capitalism. And when I was asked to talk about the U.S. response to the hurricane, it was really hard for me to talk about that because the FEMA response was not, okay, I used to talking on my okay, yes, I will do that. So I will be talking more about the response, but I do think that it was non-existent and a very bad response. And the sad thing is that that wasn't something surprising for me because it's a response that's always come from the U.S. government. So we have a deep history of imperialism, colonialism, and that's mostly the responses we get from the U.S. government. You can pass it. I want to talk a little bit about what was happening in Puerto Rico before the hurricane. And for example, in Puerto Rico, a woman is murdered every 14 days. Last year, 180 of the domestic violence cases that were reported last year were committed by police officers. And why am I talking about this? Because we do know that the women and the marginalized communities are the ones who suffer most when we have environmental crisis and environmental crisis and any kind of economic crisis. So last year, when a collective of women came out to the streets to protest, the government responded with more repression. And that way you can see that even for the US government and for the Puerto Rican government, our voices do not matter. Also in 2016, PROMESA was approved by a Democrat president, creating what is now known in Puerto Rico as la Junta de Control Fiscal. Last year, some emails were made public that exposed the links between the same junta and the US government, where it showed that the federal government has been pushing for the privatization of the Puerto Rico Electric Power Company and some other companies so they can get gains. Also, we've been a chemical testing ground in the island and a dumpster for a lot of years, from La Marina in Vieques to the deposit of coal ash and Monsanto playing and testing Agent Orange. And that same coal plant that's been polluting the environment in Puerto Rico had a big mountain of coal before the hurricane passed. So the coal was spread to the whole island when the hurricane passed. So talking about this, we see that the response to the hurricane was nothing different to what we've always seen. We've always been treated, because we're a colony, as the professor was saying, we've been imposed a lot of policies without asking. We've been met with repression, and the stories could go on, and the response is always the same: abuse and a clear message that we don't matter. So these two pictures are from where I was in the hurricane. That's my house with no, it's when the night ends. I don't remember. Yeah. And the other one is the sunrise, the day after the hurricane. You see the trees that are empty of leaves. So I do remember the hurricane as this growling monster that kept growling for 24 hours nonstop. And while I was thinking about the response from the government, the first thing I remember is going outside and seeing that my family was okay, and I was relieved to hear that. And the first responders, I would say, were the same community that were there. I remember we had communal dinners. We were taking the food out from the things that were still on the fridge. The cell phones were not working, so a lot of the news that we got were from people who were talking to other people, and we also saw a lot of people cutting trees, making roadways, and even my neighbors started to put electrical poles and tie it with chains so it wouldn't fall. So the first responses, I would say, were community responses, and I would say the most efficient responses were community responses. So I can say some FEMA responses, and so the first one, and I'm sure you've heard of this, is the government contracting inexperienced companies like Whitefish. They do spend $300 million on this company that only employed 2 people, and they also some other companies that were supposed to bring food that didn't bring the food. They had a big hospital ship on the bay in San Juan that wasn't used. They gave food that was really high in sodium. You can see one of the food there had like cookies and sausages. It was really bad food. They also did share food in mostly the same locations. They never went to my town in Atillo, but they did went to the towns in the mountains. They went to San Juan and some other towns. I remember every time I went to visit my tia in Lares, she always gave us a lot of canned foods because they had a lot of cans. And that was something that was discovered last year. There were a lot of water bottles that were stocked and they never gave them to people. And they pay a lot of money to keep them there. They did offer some assistance with the employees that lost their jobs, but it was really hard for people to gain those. And they did wanted people to apply for those assistance online, and a lot of people didn't have online access. They had to go to San Juan, and even then, it was really slow internet. And you could hear the announcements on the radio, and it says, oh yeah, you can go to this website to get access to the services. The same thing for the aid for housing repairs. At the end, they started promising loans instead of the actual aid. And also it came with requirements that were up to date with our own realities. A lot of people in Puerto Rico do not have land ownership titles, so it was really hard for them to prove, even though they were living there, the house was theirs, that was their land. They also offer hotel vouchers. President Trump threw paper towels at us. I'm sure you remember that. But this lack of response resulted in many lives lost, a massive migration, and more impoverished communities. So what I did saw was a lot of community and people organizing themselves so they could gain access to the resources they needed. This picture here is a lot of people started making those boards so they could wash the clothes. It was really hard to wash the clothes without washing machine. And they started to sell them or gift them. And yeah, we can pass. We are a lot of different groups that form. One group that I can mention is Casa Pueblo, who had electricity the next day, and they offer people electricity, people who needed the insulin to be refrigerated or respiratory machines to be plugged in. They also received a lot of supplies, batteries and solar lamps. And this other group, a lot of groups formed that are called Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, and they actually organized themselves. Some of them were there before, and they became like hubs where people could send donations, or if they had the donations, they also cooked, they met, and they tried to identify the resources of the community and try to fill the void. Again, I would say that the Puerto Ricans on the island were the ones who responded and reacted and saved themselves in this disaster. And I also want to talk about the Puerto Ricans who were able to go out, and I think they experienced a similar response. I know in Connecticut, here in Hartford, a lot of people came and they were given hotel vouchers, and they were kept on hold, and they kept extending the dates, and they could have used that money to provide rental assistance that was more stable, and people could have gotten stable jobs. Also, access to medical insurance was hard, and a lot of people that got out of the island looking for appointments or a better service had to wait a long time for the insurance to kick in. And once again, here in the U.S., we saw that the response from the government was really bad, and people had to organize themselves, and it was the community that helped the people. So after the hurricane passed, and people were still trying to recover and still live in this crisis and not knowing what to do, the government enjoyed the time so they could continue their agenda, the government and La Junta, to make more tax exceptions for millionaires. They announced the privatization of the electrical company, they closed 300 schools, the cost of the university tripled. They also announced they were closing college campuses. The pensions, some pensions they're trying to use them to pay the debt. And a lot of protests are happening right now, and people are trying to organize themselves, but they're being met with more repression. So basically, our island has become a place where investors can come and get a lot of tax exceptions and land for a cheap price. So in conclusion, I would say that the response was very horrible, and if it weren't for the people who organized themselves here and on the island, the results would have been a lot worse. And it shows how the government always acts the same way, gaining profit from our suffering.
Tim's working on that. Testing.
And I'll just say something real quick while he's pulling it up, that we're still seeing resources that were supposedly set aside 2 years ago haven't been released here. Even here in Connecticut, they set aside a bunch of money that was supposed to go to emergency assistance for different things, including roughly 100,000 or 80,000 that was supposed to come to Hartford, and they still haven't released a penny. And so when we're talking about emergency responses, the bureaucratic system just cannot and doesn't want to move fast enough to be relevant. So this is even the Connecticut state government we're talking about, not just La Junta and the government over there. So the situation of having to force your way in to get the bare minimum is something that Puerto Ricans have been experiencing for a very long time on the island and over here too. So it's something that is continuing. The families are still here. Those are now Hartford residents. They're our neighbors now, and they still need help. So we have to continue to put pressure on the government here in Connecticut to do what they have already claimed to have done. And so there's still a lot of work that we need to be doing here as well. So yeah, so Ramon, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ramon Espinoza, and I'll talk a little bit about myself in the presentation. I'll try to sort of connect it by giving special thank yous. So, Tim, if you could, next slide. Oh, one slide before. So I graduated in Trinity College with an MA in Public Policy Studies, and I went to the University of Connecticut where I majored in Political Science and I minored in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. In 2018, I traveled to the city of province and province of Santiago de Cuba and the province of Guantanamo in Cuba. This was with Disclosed Pastors for Peace. I'll talk a little bit about that. So this was very recent, and I also went to Holguin. But that wasn't the first time I've been to Cuba. I've been in 2005. I conducted ethnographic research in Havana and Pinar del Rio in Cuba, this was through Eastern Connecticut State University. And this was a unique experience because most, sort of experiences with schools center on culture and art, whereas this was really intentionally set to study the revolution of 1959 and also social institutions. In addition to that, in 2003, I traveled to Puerto Rico to study social work and meet with leaders of the DECA civil rights movements. And you'll see here in a picture, and I'm going to be addressing some things to also make the presentation a little interesting. This is in the monument to Jose Marti, which is one of the national heroes of Cuba. And he's actually buried right where his casket is right underneath. And this is a very fitting title, Two Wings of the Same Bird, two different responses to natural disasters, because for those of you that may not know, that was a poem by Lola Rodriguez de Tio, who was a Puerto Rican poet and journalist, who in essence talked about Cuba and Puerto Rico being two wings of the same bird. And she was in essence referencing the fact that the cultures are very similar. And on top of that, a lot of the national heroes collaborated with one another to support independence movements and struggles, such as Jose Marti, and for those of you that know, Ramon Emeterio Betance, the father of Puerto Rican independence and culture in the island. So there was some sort of communication between them. Next slide. So a special thank you. In addition to my studies, as Jason noted, I'm a member of the Connecticut Puerto Rican Agenda. I've also been a member of the Puerto Rican Day Parade in Hartford. So that's allowed me to sort of stay connected with a lot of sort of issues related to Puerto Rico. And I've also had the pleasure of working with the Greater Hartford Coalition on Cuba, who's worked with IFCO's Pastors for Peace, who I had an opportunity to travel to Cuba with. And this was to protest the embargo on sort of religious grounds. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide. And a special thank you to the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the People, ICAP. This is actually an organization that's in Cuba that actually worked with us and I had a chance to interact with many of them. So I'll try to sort of try to be quick with my presentation. So if you have any questions, you could feel free to ask me. But just to give you a sense of how interesting the trip was, these are all the people that went, so I'm there. And we had about 20 or some odd people. They were from all over the United States, including Germany and Mexico. And that monument in the back, I think Dr. Torre noted that Cuba's rich in culture is very true. So that's a monument to Antonio Maceo, who was actually one of the leaders of the Cuban independence movement and a general. And that sculpture, one of the biggest sculptures in Santiago de Cuba, was done by an international artist who we had an opportunity to meet and interact with, called Alberto Lescay, who's an Afro-Cuban, and who's very supportive of the efforts that, to this day, of the island in Cuba, openly admits that his parents were illiterates. His ancestors fought for independence of the island, and because of the opportunity that's in the island, he became an international known artist. So he has a fascinating story for anybody that's interested in art and the politics of art in Cuba. I encourage you to sort of look him up. Next slide. So Cuba is about 11 million people. The life expectancy is very high, 78 years for men, 82 years for women. This is right from the England, actually, the statistics. And it's also ruled by the Communist Party or governed by the Communist Party of Cuba. And I'll be talking a little bit about that as the presentation goes on. And just to give you a sense of where I was, Pinal del Rio and Havana. So Havana and Pinal del Rio is sort of further down. And that's actually the area Pinal del Rio that's very vulnerable to hurricanes, given where the island is situated. But that was the first time I went to Cuba was to sort of do the study in those two parts of the island. Now, in the bottom, you'll see Santiago de Cuba, which is near Guantanamo, and Holguin. And so that part of the island, even though I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but it's also earthquakes actually does impact that part of the island. And they also are very good. So when I talk about natural disasters, that's something else to sort of keep in the back of your mind, but it's mainly going to be on hurricanes. Next slide. Okay, so U.S. imposed commercial, economic, and financial embargo against Cuba. In Cuba, they don't consider it an embargo. They consider it a blockade. It gets very complicated. It's in terms of legalese, because they believe that the blockade is malicious to the extent that it's not only sort of imposed by the U.S., but the U.S. goes out of their way to get other countries to sort of block them economically. So just to give you a sense, el genocidio más largo de la historia. So, and I mentioned that because Cuba is poor, but now when I say poor, it's not poor in the U.S. sense. They're guaranteed a certain amount of food, a place to live, studies, but it's very hard to sort of make a certain amount of money there. But there is protections there. But part of that is because it's considered because of according to some of the people that I spoke to there, because of the blockade. It's hard for them to get materials to sort of fight, hurricanes, and it's also and do many other things. So hence, they believe it's very genocidal, sort of the approach, because it's an indirect way to really sort of affect and hurt a people. But despite that, well, before I say that, as an FYI, there's a lot of these type of signs. But just to give you a sense of how resilient and how determined they are, Santiago de Cuba, there's two expressions and two sort of city slogans. The first one is, aquí no se rinde nadie, so here nobody gives up. One, and two, esto una cosa de patria muerte. So this is a question of death or sort of land, country, or death. So that's how some of them are just that sort of determined to sort of get through these things. But nonetheless, there is a rare truce between the U.S. and Cuba when it comes to meteorological agencies exchanging satellite data, jointly analyze radar, and they collaborate on storm forecasting. That has to do with the fact that a lot of the hurricanes that come into the United States, into Florida, typically go through Cuba first. So believe it or not, there is a lot of interaction between the two islands as it relates to figuring out when the hurricanes are coming and how strong they are. And as a result, there's a lot of communication there. Next slide. Okay, so disaster management in Cuba, hurricanes and tropical storms. Despite sanctions and limited resources, Cuba has a reputable health and education system, high adult literacy rate, a compulsory schooling, higher education, readily accessible and free. This is an important fact to keep in mind when it comes to these factors having important implications for public awareness, participation, and organization for disaster management. This is especially the case when you compare it to other islands in the Caribbean, such as the Dominican Republic and Haiti and whatnot. But I'll be elaborating a bit on this later, how it's a very sort of salient but important issue. The most important disaster affecting Cuba have caused minimal loss of human life. So so they are recognized for their ability to manage hurricanes and whatnot. Next slide. Just to give you an idea, this is right from a presentation in Cuba. It's in Spanish, but in the last 20 years, there's been about, I'm translating as I go along, Cuba impacted directly for about 30 cyclones, tropical cyclones, 10 tropical storms, 20 hurricanes. And so now that changes. For those of you that have been following the news, Havana was just hit with another storm, but they had about, I think, 2 fatalities and about 100 or so people that sort of are injured. This is not exactly current, but just to give you an idea, and from this point, 54 people have died in I want to say the last 20 years. The way to read this is personas fallecidas, people that have died in Hurricane Michael, 2001, 5 people protected or helped, 7,833. Charlie in 2004, 4 people passed away. About, 232,000. Thank you, Tim. It's hard to get this angle. Ivan in September of 2004, no fatalities. But as you could see, I think the number increased almost to 2 million there. Yep. So as you could see, I think the highest number was 17 with Dennis in 2005. But very, very little loss of life, a lot of mobilizing of the people. Next slide. And this isn't just Cuba saying this. The Center for International Policy, a research and advocacy group based in Washington, says a person is 15 times as likely to be killed by a hurricane in the U.S. as in Cuba. Cuba manages hurricanes really well. We could be learning a lot from them. This is Russell L. Unruh. You may recognize his face. He was the retired lieutenant general who commanded military relief efforts after Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005. He's been to the island about 3 times to study the way that they manage hurricanes. So it all started with their defense program to hurricanes in October 1963 with Hurricane Flora. This was one of the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes recorded in history. The storm struck southwestern Haiti near peak intensity, turned to the west and drifted over to Cuba for 4 days before turning to the northwest. I want to say that there were maybe about 7,000 deaths in general. That was really a really terrible hurricane, but that may be incorrect. But nonetheless, what is correct is that there were about 1,200 deaths in Cuba. At that particular point, the government made a decision that this isn't going to happen again. And so they're going to ensure that these deaths, that this does not happen ever. And so part of it has to do with their national civil defense system. Next slide. Okay. The National Civil Defense coordinates all levels of Cuba's national disaster planning, preparation, response, and recovery. In the event of a storm, the heads of every institution, schools, hospitals, hotels, considered members of the Cuban Civil Defense Force, are responsible for the well-being of the people around them. The President of the Republic is the cabinet ministers with responsibilities for all relevant departments, and all other military, statutory, and administrative authorities are on the ground in the areas overseeing all the operations. The best way to think about this is that the whole island mobilizes for a particular hurricane. Every single one. Next slide. So the Cuban meteorology services are on alert the moment a regional tropical front is noted on weather charts and a reasonable hypothesis about its potential trajectory can be established. If the front becomes a tropical storm, detailed and practical information is provided. All relevant agencies are alerted to the potential threat before evacuations can recover, and response action plans have been activated. All necessary personnel, equipment, resources, and services are moved as close to the soon-to-be affected zone as is safe for deployment immediately after the danger has faded. So the disaster management in Cuba, the Cuban health system actually plays a very key role in terms of all this, in terms of their preparation, response, and recovery. They train health professionals in disaster medicine. I'm not going to read all of these, but some of the interesting ones: participation in community and education efforts, maintaining public health epidemiological surveillance. So in essence, diseases that could break out after the destruction of a hurricane. Planning and implementing medical services during disaster and response and recovery. Planning, providing specialized medical attention during disasters, medical teams, and other resources for vulnerable areas, care for persons with special needs, etc. So very different from Puerto Rico, where you heard a lot of stories about people not getting sort of insulin for diabetes and whatnot. So they anticipate these things ahead of time, and in essence, they try to sort of prevent that from happening because that's an important need. Slide. So, and it's so important in terms of hurricanes for them that they actually include general themes for disaster medicine in their academic courses, and especially with the Latin American Medical School curriculum. This is right from them. I, again, won't bore you with all of them, but some of the interesting ones. Socioeconomic aspects of disaster determinants. So that basically means even though that Cuba makes an effort to sort of, ensure that people are educated and have resources, there's always inequality. So they sort of look at those things and they take those things into account whenever they manage hurricanes. The role of community in confronting disasters, management of mass cadavers in disaster situations, plans for managing different types of threats or hazards, the environment and disasters. Very interesting. They make use of everything they can. So, for example, when they move people, even caves, places that are safe, they could put people in there. So, organizations of medical care and activities of the integrated systems for medical emergencies in disaster situations. So, next slide. Okay. Evacuations. So, it is a multiple process that starts with the young. Grade school students practice evacuations regularly. High school students monitor neighborhoods to identify weak trees and other hazards, even if there's a broken street and whatnot. Even the youth are organized in this effort. So again, when I say that the whole island is mobilized in this particular effort, the whole island is mobilized. If a storm increases to hurricane force and preparation of evacuations are initiated, everything that evacuees might need, including health care for everyday ailments, food, information, and communications, are provided for those who will stay with family or friends. In Pinar del Rio, the province most vulnerable to government, the government deploys large brigades to prepare for the disaster. Evacuations are massive. In the case of Matthew, almost 400,000 people were evacuated in an orderly and calmly efficient affairs. So, and just that's a very interesting sort of hurricane to study when you compare it to other countries. So if you compare the damage that Matthew did in Cuba to that of Haiti, massive deaths in Haiti, massive destruction and disorganization. Not the case in Cuba. If you have nowhere to go, then there's the state shelters with food and water and doctors. But evacuees are more likely to take shelter with family members, friends, and strangers. And sort of to echo what Agnes noted, that the best way to sort of protect yourself from the damages of a hurricane, community, and sort of learning how to sort of navigate these sort of dangerous situation. A lot of quotes that, in essence, from Cuba, from the people, regular people that are either, when you go there and you talk to them, or that when you do research for something like this, that they've learned to sort of, live for themselves, in essence, when it comes to hurricanes. That's the best sort of thinking, so that way you could sort of protect yourself and your loved ones. So, again, community is very important there. Next slide. So the recovery process. During the recovery phase, healthcare facilities evaluate the extent of their human and material losses and take measures to reestablish services where they have been interrupted, beginning with the most essential. The health system's role in hygiene and epidemiological surveillance is particularly important in this phase, again, looking to see what kind of hazards or diseases or whatnot could come out from the damage, including testing the quality of the water and preventing introduction of vectors, borne diseases. So, for example, in 2005, when Hurricane Wilma resulted in flooding along Havana's shoreline, public health teams, including hundreds of medical students, went house to house to test for the water contamination. Everyone whose home has been damaged by the hurricane will have at least half of the cost of repairs covered by the state and can easily avail of low-interest credits to cover the other half. And that's, again, another important phase for community, where people sort of, work with one another to see if they could get lower rates. They know somebody that could sort of fix a sort of dangerous situation or something that was damaged. So just some pictures to give you a visual sense of what it looks like on the ground. So these are just from Cuba. Forgive the megapixel quality, but you have, again, here people, sort of government officials working with people. That's how it kind of sort of starts to give you a sense of what it may look like. Right? So here, again, people come together and they start sort of clearing debris. Just again, it's hard work, but everybody sort of plays a role. It's important. And so again, just fixing the roof when sort of there's damage. And this is a picture of when people get mobilized, and so that there's, when they're moving people along, and just to keep them entertained, people sort of do shows and whatnot. They dress up, and so they kind of do sort of fun things. So that's just how something might look like when people are being are being evacuated. Okay. So lessons that could be learned. So the first one, as I noted, public education and awareness is an important role for healthcare providers throughout the system. It is very critical, beginning with family, physicians, and nurses, part of a larger effort coordinated by the civil defense, which involves schools, work centers, mass media, and social organizations, among others. And there is a strong state control. This means that Cuba can mandate evacuations, mobilize quickly, not a model that could be fully replicated. And just the last slide, and this is actually a quote from Fidel Castro. It's, I'm going to be translating, so excuse me. We're lucky to have had a revolution that could guarantee that, you know, nobody's going to sort of be wandering around in the forgetfulness, and, you know, and sort of and it'll be the forgetfulness. A strong, energetic, and civil defense protects our country and our population. So again, and I noted that that's not something that could easily be replicated because of the strong centralization that's in the island. But those are some of the things, some of the takeaways. So thank you.
All right, well, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, but before we do that, I do just want to put a couple numbers in context. So we talked about there was, 50 or so deaths that happened in the last 20 years in Cuba. Does anybody know roughly how many people died in Hurricane Maria just in Puerto Rico? 4,645, minimum, right? Minimum. That's the conservative estimate, right? So we're talking thousands, like 1,000 times how many folks passed away. So the difference is not just in a political difference, right? Like this is really a difference in how many people survive the various natural disasters that occur on the island that are going to continue to happen too, especially as climate change continues to accelerate how storms are hitting our shores. But I'm willing to open up to the audience. If there's anybody that has a question, I'd be happy to do it. I have a few of my own, but I'm happy to have, if there's anybody else that would like to pose one.
Jason?
Yeah, sure.
If I could back up a couple of the things that Ramon said. Thank you. The United Nations has classified Cuba. They say, has called Cuba the world leader in risk reduction. Right? This is the United Nations. It's not, the Cubans themselves. And anyway, there was one other, but I just thought that is an important one because, again, we're talking about a third world country, a country that has. I'm using the term loosely. It really is meaningless in many ways, but they don't have the financial resources. Supposedly, the United States does. Yet, I still remember when I was 10 years old, I used to play around with radios, and I got the shortwave and stuff. And this message came in like from out of the clouds when I was playing with this radio. It came in from Spain, and it said in Spanish, nations should not be judged as to how advanced they are by their advancement in technology, but rather the way they take care of their people.
It seems our financial resources are detrimental to our welfare.
All right. Any questions from the audience? All right. So
Well, I think that last slide with the quote from Fidel Castro actually says it all, because Cuba made a socialist revolution, and that's what makes all the difference. We often have these discussions about health care. Some Americans have actually gone to Cuba to get their medical education. Pastors for Peace arranges for that. And when they come back here, they're committed to try to work in underserved communities in the U.S. But they're running up against a system that's based on private profit rather than a system that's based on human needs. So you can't really replicate the Cuban medical system. You can't really replicate the Cuban disaster system unless you have a revolution. So that's why some of us think that's necessary in Puerto Rico, and it's also necessary in the United States, and it's necessary in every other country of the world. So I think that's my takeaway from this. I think that what happened to those two hurricanes just shows you in stark contrast the difference between two social systems. I just also want to mention there's an opportunity to visit Cuba. The best thing to do is to go to Cuba and see it for yourself. There's a May Day Brigade taking place April 21st to May 4th. I have some information on the table back there.
Right on. Thank you. And I would just want to replicate that with Puerto Rico, right? I think one of the best things you can do for the island is go to the island, right? Go see it for yourself, go help the people that are actually there, and that way there's no confusion over whether it's somebody's opinion or political understanding that is changing how we perceive things. But I do have a quick question. If there's folks here have questions, just raise your hand. But I do want to ask, there are plenty of folks out there in internet world that would say, if Puerto Rico was simply a state, none of this would have happened. Oh my God. Right? And so I know there's folks that just believe this. So do you think the response would have been different if Puerto Rico was a state? And we'll start with Ramon and then go this way.
I think if it was a state, we just have to look at the dangers of Hurricane Katrina and some of the other natural disasters, and that would probably be the result. Just a few so I don't think if it were a state, it would, in essence, have helped Puerto Rico in that sense, because we have examples here in the state, in the United States, of natural disasters striking where people suffer greatly, and financially, the aftermath financially. But I do want to sort of mention a couple of things, and I think that Dr. Torre noted that the self-determination is actually very important, and the finances. So if you ever go to Cuba, like, as I noted, they're poor. But when I say poor, they're not U.S. poor. What I mean by that is that, so for example, in some of the places where we stayed, some of the hotels, and when we stayed some people, they may not have sort of hot water, may be a luxury, you see? So that type of thing, where you may have to sort of, manually flush the toilet type of thing. However, it's one of the safest places where you could go. So I would literally, I slept very little when I went to the island, because I was so busy, running around everywhere, trying to get to know people, trying to figure out what's going on, what's the store, what's about, talking to people, and getting people's perspectives. So financially, because of the economic system, the blockade that they have, it is difficult for them. So again, it's hard for them to get materials. When I spoke to some of the people that manage hurricanes and earthquakes, they would love to sort of, one of the things, so for example, they may have to go to China and sort of get something that they could probably get in the States because of it may be closer, it may lower cost, right? So things like that are important. It has a lot of old buildings that, where the deterioration is an issue. And I couldn't help, when I spoke to the people that sort of talked about hurricanes, I asked them point blank, and I tried to challenge them a bit. Well, in Puerto Rico, it was a very, very strong hurricane. It hit the country, the island, sort of dead on. What can Cuba sort of withstand that type of blow? And their response unanimously was, if Cuba it gets hit with a hurricane with that strength, it'll be a blessing. It'll be the best thing that could happen to them, because as part of their policy, whenever there is a hurricane, they have to rebuild and in a way that protects the place. And it sort of takes into account that particular experience. And when that happens, financially, the island goes out of their way to sort of fix the things that were damaged. They also get, and I asked them in terms of resources, where do they get it? Any strong left-leaning country that allies with them, so Venezuela has been very helpful. That's helped them. So just some things to sort of keep in mind.
So I would say no. If we remember, Hurricane Katrina passed, and what happened was that a lot of people had to move, and a lot of schools were privatized. And I think maybe one of the differences is that the U.S. is a capitalist society, so it's gonna try to find gain from whatever situation it encounters. And I'm not saying Cuba is a socialist in every sense of the way, but maybe has different values, so they have a different view of how to react to a natural disaster. That's different from the U.S. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, first I found the other thing that I wanted to respond to, that since the 1960s, Cuba is the only country ever to be declared by the United Nations as 100% free of illiteracy, right? And this was done by the people. It wasn't done by bringing in an Anglo to be the superintendent, the Secretary of Education, or bringing in Betsy the Boss or anybody like that. Children actually went into the mountains para alfabetizar the population, you know, to teach them how to read, that sort of thing. But going back to the question of statehood and that sort of thing, first of all, it's a tricky question because right now, Puerto Rico is culturally, racially, and linguistically undigestible by the United States. They don't want us, right? They don't want us like that. They want the country. The only problem with Puerto Rico is that too many Puerto Ricans, right? And we've had, people keep having babies. And the population, now we have almost twice as many Puerto Ricans outside of Puerto Rico than we have in the United States, than in Puerto Rico. And so that diaspora has really gone to bat, as I think it's been mentioned here, has gone to bat. We are still Puerto Ricans. There's no such thing as a Puerto Rican American for many reasons. First of all, it doesn't make any sense. Because if you believe in independence, well, we are an occupied country. And so, we come here because of me. I personally say I have never been to the United States. I've never been to the United States. The United States came to me, right? Imagine that the map of the United States is made out like a rubber band, and you take the piece in Florida and you wrap it around Puerto Rico. And so I never came to the United States. The United States came to me, so all of a sudden I find myself inside this system, and that's where things, when we leave, I think it was a system until about 10 years ago or something like 70% of all Puerto Ricans in the United States still had Spanish, and most of those use Spanish as their first language. So we haven't melted. The other thing is, and if you're pro-statehood, then it doesn't make sense to say Puerto Rican American, like it doesn't make any sense to say Connecticut American, New York American, Hawaiian, none of that stuff. Okay, the other thing is that they are trying to make Puerto Rico acceptable as a state. And there are a whole lot of stuff. I'll just go down very quickly. Oh, gracias. The privatization that Agnes talked about, that is very real, and privatizing all kinds of things. And that is, it's too long to go into, but that is the economic theory of someone named Friedrich von Hayek. A lot of people don't understand what the situation is in terms of economics in this country. This country was heavily Keynesian. Even, what's his name, Richard Nixon was a strong Keynesian. And Keynesian is capitalist, but it believes in a social safety net. People are going to fall. Capitalism, by its very nature, cannot have full employment. If somebody tells you it can, either they're lying or they're naive, because it cannot. So people are going to fall. Under Keynesian economics, you put safety nets, right, in one form or another. At least part of a heart. Maybe not a whole heart, but part of a heart. Under von Hayek, which is the one that we've been under since Reagan, actually. And I could go on forever because actually this came from Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher in England, right? She ran into this guy. Nobody wanted him. The only people who could stand him was the University of Chicago, who were instrumental in tearing down the socialist government in Chile. That's another story. And so even the University of Chicago kicked him out eventually. And he went back to his native Austria with his tail between his legs. And, just totally at the end of his career, nobody wanted him and so forth until Margaret Thatcher discovered him. And people who know Thatcher say that it's the only person she ever kowtowed down to, that she sat at his lap like a little girl in front of God, right? And brought him to England and destroyed the unions, changed everything in England. I've met people in England who are still, bitter about what happened 30, 40 years ago. And she picks up the phone and calls Ronald Reagan and says, hey, Ronnie, I got some guy here you're going to like. Right? And so the idea, Keynesian economics is incredibly dense to understand. Even a lot of economists don't understand it. But the basic is that private is good, public is bad. And so you privatize everything. Ronald Reagan's gift, if you want to call it that, is that he was able to take this Keynesian dense philosophy and turn it into sound bites, right? Do you think it's your patriotic duty to give your hard-earned money to a bunch of bozos down in Washington, D.C.? Or do you know better how do you spend your own money? And obviously, who the heck is going to say, yeah, I'd like to give my money to a bunch of bozos? So this is how you start cutting taxes. And by cutting taxes, you cut back on social services because that's not important. See, capitalism, some people say it's bad. I don't know whether it's bad or good. I just know that it's indifferent. It doesn't give a heck. It really doesn't care. It's only business. Okay, so population exchange. This is big time taking place in Puerto Rico. About almost 2 years ago, there was a conference on Puerto Rico. It was going on with the economic crisis and so forth at Yale, at which I made a statement, and all the experts got down on me. And I said, you know, the United States is exchanging our population. They're bringing in rich, super millionaire Anglos, and the Puerto Ricans are leaving. And they said, no, that's not happening now. It's fairly obvious. You know, they're building multi-million-dollar condominiums that only super rich people can come. Most of those are not going to be Latinos or African Americans or Native Americans coming down to Puerto Rico to settle. And you have to settle. You have to make yourself a resident of Puerto Rico. And at the same time, there's something that we have forgotten about, which the United States hasn't forgotten about, and they want, and that is that Puerto Rico has 13 areas of mines, mineral concentration. That came out in the 1970s. It's the only time that I've ever seen in Puerto Rican history in which everybody, whether you were pro-statehood, pro-independence, pro-commonwealth, people stood literally when they realized that the U.S. had been telling us the only thing rich about us was our name, Puerto Rico. You know, we don't have any natural resources. And then it was discovered that those mines that did not exist had already been sold to American Metal Climax and other mining interests. And the people in Puerto Rico in the 70s actually stood on the areas where they wanted to exploit, and they said, over our dead bodies, we're going to exploit this. And so the government pulled back, and we have forgotten about it. Now, it's mostly in the center of the country. What's going on? Why is it that it was the center of the country that got the electricity last? Right? Yeah, there's mountains. They're not mountains like, you know, the Himalayas, right? And Hawaii has mountains, and other states have mountains, and montaña, you know? And they got the electricity up there. But if you voluntarily depopulate the center of the island, and all of a sudden you can pick that up for a song, if not for free, because it'll be abandoned, and then you start exploiting. Once they do those kinds of things, then little by little, the population of Puerto Rico will go the way of Hawaii, will go the way of Texas, will go the way of New Mexico, even though New Mexico is still 51 to 53% of Mexican descent. But the educational system there has assimilated a lot of those folks, and 51% is not a big majority to hold it back. Alaska, all of these places. So I don't think Puerto Rico is digestible at this moment as a state. I agree with them that even if it was a state, it would not have made any major difference because you still got a bunch of spics, right, of multiracial spics that are not digestible. And so the same way that African Americans in New Orleans, you know, got shafted, we would get shafted the same way. And we need to really pay attention because they're taking our country away from us. They are exchanging the population.
Thank you. Yeah, and just one point I want to add to is a term that some folks may have heard before, which is disaster capitalism. Naomi Klein has put out a lot of information on it and recently has a rather small book, it's an easy read, specifically on the battle for Puerto Rico, called Battle for Paradise. And so it's something that I always want to remind folks because a lot of people think statehood is this sort of magic wand that would solve a lot of problems, but disaster capitalism is happening in New Orleans right now. And so after New Orleans, they wiped out all the public schools. And so right now, can anybody guess how many traditional public schools still exist in New Orleans? 0. It is all charter schools. And so not half the schools, not some percentage of the schools, all of them, right? And that is waterfront property, as is lots of places in Puerto Rico. So I think it is, personally, it is more than indifferent. It is pushing on these situations and having the worst possible outcome for the people happening, And so it is something that is clear to me that if Flint, Michigan has to wait years just to get clean water, clearly statehood is not the solution to Puerto Rico's problems. However, we do live in a capitalist country, and so we do want to raise some money for the church here. It's not going to go to any of our organizations. This is just for the church that allowed us to have this beautiful space, and we should use this space more often. It's gorgeous and huge. So if folks have means and can contribute, I'm just going to pass around this little basket, and if you're able, please do make a donation. Thank you so much. And so this is just going to the church. And then, we'll have Millie has a question.
I just wanted to make a comment about what the professor said. Right after the storm, the military was in Utuado. They were hit very hard. My family on both sides is from Utuado. And the military was there, but they were not helping the people. You know where they were? Occupying the copper mines. That's where they were. And so when you ask the military, why weren't you distributing all this food that was in the San Juan docks before I went to Cuba? When I came back from Cuba 2 weeks later, the food was still there. You ask them, why weren't you distributing this food? And they tell you they had no direct order. They didn't have any orders. Then you ask the governor of Puerto Rico why the food wasn't distributed, and they said they didn't have truck drivers, they didn't have drivers with licenses, they didn't have trucks. But we know that was a lie because truck drivers went there with their licenses, and they were denied. They were rejected. So I want to know why FEMA, what excuse they've given. Does anyone know?
Well, let me just say quickly that, going back to capitalism, all of those bottles of water, all the food, the medicine that went to rot, in the ports, those containers, a bunch of containers that went to rot, because that was going to be free. But guess what happened to the containers brought in by Walmart? Those are distributed instantly, right? Because that's going to bring in some money. And so I understand from Ramon that in Hartford you still use the term poverty pimps, right? Well, talk about poverty pimps. Taking advantage of people's misery to make money. That's basically what that is. And so FEMA went to several towns, several times, and never once even helped people fill out applications. They did nothing. And when they were questioned, what they said was, oh, we're here to assess the situation. Like, contra, It's a mess. What else you need to know?
Any other questions?
Just to get away from statehood, I wanted to ask Agnes if you have a sense of how people feel on the ground. I don't know if people are still in that survival mode, but what is the feeling on the ground around independence? And given what you said about the community response to the disaster, has a lot of the time it's not just one thing that communities work on together, right? You work on food, you work on survival, but you also work on art and community and a lot of different things at the same time. So I wonder if you have a sense of that, of how people are feeling about independence, if the response to the hurricane has impacted that at all on the ground there.
That's a very interesting question, and I think the hurricane did challenge a lot of the beliefs people had about being U.S. citizens and the privilege that gave us. But still, I think it's very difficult, and a lot of people still think that statehood is going to be this magic wand that's going to help everyone. I do think that one thing that did change in a lot of people's minds is that they empowered themselves and they saw that it was efficient for themselves to organize, and they had the power. And they did what they needed to do, and the government didn't do anything. So they did have a lot of power. And I think that's something that changed a little bit in people's minds, knowing that even though the government is there, we are the ones who have the power. But in terms of statehood versus independence, a lot of people still think that if independence come, they're gonna take the streets away and the Burger Kings are gonna go and we're gonna enter the dark ages. And people think that, so it's still a long way to go.
I have a question for Agnes. It's my impression from being there, I was just there like 4 months ago and before and that sort of thing, that a lot of the people that are leaving are more of the pro-independence people, so the people who are pro-statehood are staying behind. Is that your sense at all? Because that would be a major issue.
I think it would be. I don't think so. I think it's difficult. People that have education, it's easier. People who are bilingual to get jobs. And I know some of the people who came when the vouchers were offered, they did encounter a different, we do have this idea, a lot of people have this idea of how the U.S. is this perfect place and you get assistance, and once you get here, you start to, it's not that easy. We don't have affordable housing, we don't have access to, the insurance is more expensive. So a lot of people that do not have the privilege to be bilingual maybe go back. Because in Puerto Rico, it's the mantengo. Yeah. The government still benefits from that because people vote for them and they offer, and we still have residenciales where people pay like, I don't know, $30 a month for rent. So, yeah. But I don't know the statistics. I think it's half and half, I would say.
Okay, so it seems that we're really all aware of the issues with Puerto Rico. Better? Yeah, okay. And, you know, I guess I'm just more interested on how do we fix these issues, right? Because I love Puerto Rico. And I'm, you know, super aware. I did my master's in public policy. I did my dissertation on the Puerto Rican economic crisis. I'm familiar. You know, I also got to meet a ton of people from South America who were like, oh, you're American. I'm like, you don't understand. We are discarded people. We are not American in their eyes. So how do we fix this situation?
Revolution.
Who wants to get started?
One word.
Something that, so just a couple things that I think are very important. And it's just early on where, even with the doctor, right, where he said that these are statistics that come from the UN, so it's not from Cuba, right? I think we have this thing in our minds where because of the Cold War and the history with Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis and whatnot, that, you know, it just, and it's very complicated to sort of talk about, where I've heard people from Puerto Rico say, well, if something happens, if we become independent, we'll be like Cuba and Venezuela type of thing, you know? Yeah. But when I went there, to Cuba, think of it like this. This is, a country, again, two wings of the same bird, a country that's very similar to Puerto Rico, that's sanctioned in every human way that you could imagine, and people dance, they eat, they go out, they read. Puerto Rico can definitely be independent.
Their kids go to college for free?
They're not starving to death as it's typically thought about here. Now, when you talk about them seriously, they do say that financially it's difficult, so the government is trying to figure out a way to raise wages. They're doing that in very different ways. They're currently going through I think they're done, but when I was there, a constitutional sort of changes that were happening. There was a campaign. And the idea there was very different than the United States, where the Constitution can be changed, taking into account, you know, contemporary issues. You see? So, and what I would say to that is self-determination, autonomy, and independence, I think is good because it makes somebody, you have to take care of yourself, and you don't have to depend on others. So in Cuba, when I think it was Millie, where she was talking about how, you know, water was just staying there, food is rotting. From what I understand and from what I saw and what I was told, that would not happen in Cuba because food is, they just don't have the resources. They can't afford to have that happen. So, and it's because they have to be independent. And so the thing is, that gives you an ability to sort of move and survive. And so I think autonomy and independence and whatnot is something that needs to be sort of looked at, self-determination and those type of things. One other lightning quick thing too, because it talked about the privatization and whatnot in Cuba, and there's some people in the audience that may know a little bit more about this than I do, where I think there are a lot of business ventures that are happening with other countries. It's really just the U.S., but you see people from Spain, you see people from all these other parts of the world. But the idea is that sort of the communal needs come before the individual needs. So like property there where the government owns some buildings and there's a joint venture, the way it works is you could come and work with the Cuban government, but they have 50% ownership plus one. So in case something happens where there's a sort of social need, then they have the ability to say we have to really reconfigure this relationship. And that's not something that may happen with the way that sort of property and whatnot is managed in the States. You see?
Yeah.
Well, I think several things need to happen. Puerto Rico is quite different from Cuba at this point because of, again, capitalism and colonialism and so forth. Education has got to be one of our most powerful tools. I don't want to say weapons, tools. The other one is our own culture. We love our culture. And I don't care if you're pro-statehood or pro-independence, people stand up for their culture. Cuando Monica, won the gold medal in the Olympics, everybody and their brother was Puerto Rican, whether I just voted for statehood and 10 million other things. Okay, so those are the things. In Cuba, I was also in Cuba some time back, and I noticed that education goes beyond the classroom. Right? One of the things, a couple of things stand out, many things, but a couple of things stand up. I went to a number of bookstores. I was looking for a particular book, and just as I was getting there, the book had sold out. They were selling like hot bread. And I'm saying, wow, people read and all this. And finally, maybe the 7th bookstore I went to, I finally found the book, and I bought it, and then I asked the store manager, in my search here in all of these different bookstores, I saw so many books, capitalist books, not about capitalism, but capitalist books. And I said, how come in a socialist country you have so much capitalist material? And the guy really stood up very straight. And he says, in Cuba, we get information wherever it is. We have no qualms about it. If it's a capitalist book, it's something we can use, we use it. Right? In the United States, you can't even say the word communism. Right? People still go under the bed. And so, education, the charters, you mentioned the charters in New Orleans. Yeah. Guess what just passed in Puerto Rico within the last 6 months? Charter school legislation that was fought tooth and nail by the teachers, educators on the island, and they're taking away history, Puerto Rican history.
Oh my God.
So now you're only going to get some variation of Puerto Rican history in high school, maybe in middle school, and there are no blacks in those history books on Puerto Rico, and virtually no women. And especially the women who are patriotas, those are not there at all. Lola Etillo, Luisa Capetilla, all those folks are totally out. So that's one thing in terms of education that we need to deal with. The other is, and I've never said this in public, so I'm kind of hesitating. I told Ramon yesterday. You'll hear about this soon. There are a number of us who are working to establish a Taíno village in Puerto Rico, La Villa Taína, Indígena, for many reasons. The main reason is to maintain that culture, which is still in us. If you look at Christopher Columbus's diary and how he describes the people, he's almost describing the people that are there today, right? Our way of being and so on and so forth. But here's another angle. We discovered that according to international law, any nation that was invaded by force and occupied is still considered by international law as being autonomous, as still being independent. So, we've done this with Puerto Rico as it is now, you know, that the U.S. invaded and all of that, but you could say, well, but you were under the control of Spain. Okay? But the Taínos were not under the control of Spain until the Spanish came, right? So that, there is a clear case of having been invaded, and we're still there. By the way, I am a Taíno. I mean, you can look if you take away the beard, right? And so a number of us are working to establish this village, again, for the customs, for all of that, but also to have this new angle to approach, not just in the United Nations, but in the international courts of justice and that sort of thing.
Thank you. I was just going to say that according to the Constitution, the transaction between U.S. and Spain is considered illegal because there was no representation, no body of a Puerto Rican legislative. We were already autonomous. Yeah.
Like 2 weeks.
Yeah. So that's why a lot of people, there's a bunch of people on the island that believe that we're just an occupied territory.
So I have an important question real quick because we don't want to dwell on it too much, but for this particular group, one of the things, and you can answer her question and follow up with this one, what do you think the role of the diaspora is going to be in helping to rebuild Puerto Rico? And so I asked this also in the context of Cuba, because Cuba did not have twice the population somewhere else, right? And so it is a really important piece for everybody here. What part do we play? What part of the decision-making process do we have, not actually being on the island, but having the ear of Congress?
Well, before getting to that, I think that's super important. But I did say that soon you're going to find out about this, and soon is April 4th. Why? I'm also a professor of education, truth and, truth and lending. I didn't say anything about that. And at Southern Connecticut State University, I direct the Latino Native American Film Festival. And on April 4th, the festival this year is going to start on April 3rd with a film from Cuba called Conducta. Incredible film about education, too long to go into, but whoever's interested, give me your email, we'll send you stuff out. And then on the 4th, we're bringing in, we're hoping to get the Peabody Center here, the Peabody Museum, the Native American Research Center at one of the casinos at Foxwood, I believe it is, the Yale American Indian Center, and the people that I just talked about who are putting together the village in Puerto Rico, and to have all day of Native American kinds of things with concentration on Taínos. So that's when, it'll be made public and all of this.
Before everybody leaves, I just want to say, go to Cuba, see it for yourself, and talk to the people. Go out on the streets and talk to the people. You'll see the difference. Absolutely. I went right before right after the hurricane, and I saw the difference. The U.S. was all about U.S. interests, who was going to get what contract after the hurricane. In Cuba, it was about the people, about supporting the people, getting them, back into their homes.
So before we go, I want to make sure this question is addressed. So the diaspora, I'm talking specifically about other Puerto Ricans that live in the States.
So just to sort of address that, but before I do, for those of you, another reason to go to Cuba, and just to sort of piggyback on what the doctor mentioned, Carlos. So there's also, as the title of this event, Two Wings of the Same Bird, Shared History. For those of you that are interested in Taíno history, when you go there, there's an actual Taíno that his statue is sort of prevalent. It's called Atuey, and he's considered to be the first rebel of Latin America and the Caribbean. And so he was basically a Taíno that actually led a group of a cacique that led a group of Taínos to rebel against the Spanish, and he was burned to death. But he's considered to be somebody respected there. So there's a lot to learn too. Now, to answer Jason's question, the thing is with the Puerto Rican community is that historically they're culturally nationalistic, not ultra nationalistic. It's not like, you know, Puerto Ricans and us, we love other people, but economic nationalism and political nationalism has always lacked. So I think the role of the diaspora is to figure out a way where they could sort of develop political and economic nationalism, so that way they could have a stronger voice and they could protect their own particular interests, and sort of work with different groups too that that are interested in that empowerment. And that could take many, many different forms. But I think it's realizing that you know, sort of the cultural nationalism have kept the people alive, have not made them digestible with the United States. But the problem is that cultural nationalism in and of itself it can't really get very far without the economic and political nationalism. And so I think that that's where they need to sort of go and start thinking.
So I would say to have discussions. As a Puerto Rican who was raised in Puerto Rico, sometimes I don't even know what us Puerto Ricans think about what we want from Puerto Rico or Puerto Rico to become. And I don't know what the diaspora wants Puerto Rico to become. So we need to start having conversations about it. And we wouldn't want to happen that the diaspora feels like they want to take some decisions about what's happening on the island, and people are doing some other stuff on the island. So start having conversations and see how can we collaborate. And also, there's a lot of people, Puerto Ricans living here, who are staying and have a lot of needs. So what can Puerto Ricans here do to get access to those resources they need? So, yeah.
I agree. I think we need to, as much as possible, keep this dialogue between the two populations, because it can be lost very easily. Now through social media and all kinds of things, it can be strengthened in certain ways, but it's not the same as face-to-face. It's not the same as the back and forth. I actually wrote a book some years ago titled The Commuter Nation, Perspectives on Puerto Rican Migration. And it, you know, the first chapter is called La Guagua Aérea, you know, the Airbus, going back and forth and that sort of thing. And we're still doing that. Literally at the time of that book was published, on any given day we had at least 5,000 Puerto Ricans literally up in the air, right, going or coming between the two. That kept the culture from separating from each other. I think at some point, and Ramon and I discussed a little bit of this last night, Puerto Ricans in the U.S. need to be included in a lot of the important decisions about the future of the country. When I say the country, I mean Puerto Rico. It is a country. We are a nation. We are a nationality, right? And the Ecuadorians do it. I participated, friend with the previous Ecuadorian consul here. They were electing a president in Ecuador from here, from Gateway Community College, and later from one of the schools in New Haven. I won't mention the name. It has something to do with Columbus, but but in any case, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, from the very beginning, as late back as the 60s, they recognized the diaspora as part of the Puerto Rican population because it is a divided nation, right? The Independence Party would not touch it, right? Had some tendencies toward elitism and whatever else. But recently, even the pro-independence, the Puerto Rican Independence Party is recognizing the diaspora and trying to bring them in. Now, hopefully it's not just for their gain. You know, I think it's got to be recognized that whatever the future of Puerto Rico is, it's got to be determined by all Puerto Ricans, not just those who happen to be breathing in Puerto Rico, right? But those of us here who still consider that our nation, our country. And so we have every legitimate way. And you see this all over the place. You see there's people from other countries are able to vote and have something to say about their country. So I think that's one of the things we can do and maintain the relationships that we developed as a result of the hurricane and that sort of thing. New Haven alone raised, I may have lowballed this, but at least $150,000 in a weekend to send to Puerto Rico. And what was done in New Haven was not to give it to one of the charities and then all of that starts being filtered out, you know, for this and for that. People literally went to Puerto Rico and distributed and took money, bought stuff in Puerto Rico so it would feed the national, you know, the national, yeah, and then distributed mattresses, washing machines, you know, all kinds of things like that. Wow. So I think we need to continue to do that and come up with new ways and, you know, break out of the box. We are so incredibly creative as a people. I think, let me put it this way, and I hate the analogy because it's so bellicose, but we actually have a nuclear arsenal and we come out fighting with pea shooters, right? And bows and arrows at best, right? We need to tap into our cultural creativity, which is such a deep part, just like it is in Cuba.
I just have to add a little bit more to that, and just really for everybody, not just Puerto Ricans, but everybody to think. I mean, here in Hartford, where you have a significant amount of the population that is Puerto Rican, and I've done a lot of work. Unfortunately, not just them, but people in general, they haven't had the same opportunities for education. Jose Marti, another sort of, you know, in terms of Cuba, you see this quote everywhere where it says, the only real freedom is an educated person. That's the only freedom, you know? And so the thing is, sometimes here, because of the way the system is, not just at a national level, but I mean just on a local level, let's just look at Hartford, people just don't have time to be informed and to be educated on a lot of different things. And as a result, we have a very impoverished city that has a lot of issues. And it's, you know, I don't think those issues are being responded to very well. So it's, I personally think that if we had sort of cultural empowerment and educational, political, and economic empowerment, it'll be very different. But I think, I say this because these are great things, right? But, you know, it's important to have next steps and action and take action and have a good sort of plan to sort of do that, and people to sort of organize locally and try to sort of make that a reality. But you don't have to go very far to see where the issues are. If you know Hartford really well, you know that, you know, there's a lot of people that need help, you know, and a lot of them are Puerto Rican, African Americans and whatnot, but in many ways they're all in the same boat, and it's just sort of thinking deeper, you see? So I think that, I don't know if that made a lot of sense, but it's something that I think sort of goes into what we're talking about.
It's been a struggle for the agenda since day one, right, of exactly what it is that we should be doing. Should we be finding housing for Puerto Ricans that are here? Or should we be addressing colonialism? Should we be raising funds to send back? Should we be trying to do employment efforts? Should we be sending Puerto Ricans to go live back on the island? And like I've said to folks here, if we have 8 million Puerto Ricans, you're going to get 9 million different opinions on what we should do with Puerto Rico. And so,
the answer is yes.
Right.
To everything.
Sure, it just takes a tremendous amount of resources to say yes to every single one of those, and we don't live in a country, you know, that supports that kind of work in the way that I would, you know, wish that we did. And so living in a space of limited resources, we've seen our limited resources be exploited for various reasons. And so I'm always trying to figure out, how do we build that consensus when we have colonialism destroying our history, right? And so it's a very complicated thing. Even within the organization of the agenda, we have incredible tensions about what to do to move forward, right? And so part of the reason we want to keep the agenda pushing and mobilizing folks is to start to find those points of consensus, because I do think the hurricane, you know, I lived in Puerto Rico multiple times and have gone back and forth. And just the difference in my Facebook feed after having done that will change your life. Like, it seems like a small thing, but the fact that I have 100 Puerto Rican close friends that when they said this is what's happening politically, I can pull directly from that. Where if you've never lived on the island, it's going to be very difficult to get that direct contact with folks. That's why I always say, if you're a diasporican, go to the island, right? It's the #1 thing that you can do is to go there. Because for me, the hurricane did change who and how we perceive the word of diaspora, because so many people that previously maybe were angry at the diaspora are now part of it. And so the numbers are starting to switch and people are moving back and forth, and it's like half a family is here and half a family is there. It was always the case a little bit, but the hurricane crystallized the tensions that were there, and I think in a positive way for as a people. Aside from the suffering that happened, the communication channels that were set up, the response from the diaspora to the issue was not one of neglect or disinterest, right? Like the diaspora was organizing a little too fast, actually. Like there was people mobilizing and trying to help without seriously discussing how that is going to impact the folks on the island. How do you actually get supplies to an island when the Jones Act is a thing, right? So there was a lot of things that had to be confronted in that moment when people were very sad and tense, right? And so I think that change is something we have to continue to build on, right? So we kind of break down this idea that there's a them over there and an us over here, and we're totally separate, right? The internet connects us all, economics connect us all, and clearly, like suffering and after the natural disasters definitely connects us all. So I think we just got to keep pushing, and if folks have other communities that they know would like to have a forum like this, other towns in Connecticut, other spaces like university settings or whatever it may be, we just have to keep pulling people together because they're going to continue to keep trying to divide us over and over and over and over. And for me, the only thing that can really solve that is collective action. Even if it's not perfect, even if people, think they could do it better or whatever it may be, it's pushing people to work together in spaces to kind of find that consensus. And so we'll just give folks a couple of minutes to have last comments, and then we'll wrap up and thank everybody for coming. And so we'll start with Dr. Torre and go this way.
As Ramon and I were talking about last night, there really is no shortage of good people doing good things. Right? We don't have a shortage there. The shortage is of us knowing about each other and us collaborating with each other. That's where the shortage is. So we've got a lot of people doing, wonderful things. Organizations cropping up all over the place. Community groups and that sort of thing in Puerto Rico, here, all over the place. One of the things I'd like to do, I don't know if anybody here is savvy enough to help me put together a website in which you can connect people, and just put it up there. Mira, you're a good person. By the way, that's what Taino means, right? Taino means good people. It was a misnomer when Columbus came. The Taínos, the natives came out, and they were telling them, don't fear us. We're good people. We're not here to do it. Taino, I'm a good person. And they thought that was their name, Taino. And so, but good people, if all of us are Taínos here, or all of us are good people, let's connect with other good people who are doing good things and collaborate. Because that's the only way it's going to happen. We don't have the monies. We don't have, all of those kinds of resources, but we do have people resources, which can be more powerful than having a bunch of money and putting people to work on stuff they don't really believe in.
So I would like to see more spaces where people can talk about this in a less formal way with less maybe academic structure, and also make space for people who speak only Spanish so they could feel comfortable talking about what they want for Puerto Rico to look like.
Terrible to be the last person because then it's like all the good answers are taken. But I would say the same exact thing. I mean, there's a lot of good organizations here that in the city, but I mean, there's 3 here that sort of do a lot of different types of work, but there's a lot of similarities. So I think the idea is to sort of know people and get to know people and try to sort of want to make a difference. And I think just to sort of piggyback off what the other 2 speakers mentioned, very important, but eventually it's just a question of how far could somebody go to sort of make change. And so I think eventually taking action steps once you feel comfortable is very important. And of course, sort of information and education and getting to know. And just in this experience, aside from Cuba, I've also traveled I visited China, Germany, Rome, Paris, Mexico, Puerto Rico 3 times, Canada, and different parts of the United States, and I've met a lot of different people, and you learn different ways it's possible to do different things. And it's just not one way of doing things. And I think experiences like that are important, so, and getting to know other people and sharing. So just to echo what Agnes mentioned and what Carlos mentioned.
politics of division as executed in the city of Hartford, Connecticut. Step 1. Hartford is a town that is basically divided into 3 ethnic groups. First being Latino or Spanish-speaking. The second being African-American or Black. The third being European or white. As a practical matter, each group in and of itself is a political minority. Most of the power, real power, is in the hands of a white European minority. Now, it is important to understand that this is not a racial issue. It is a political power dynamic issue. And race really is irrelevant. No one political minority can maintain power without the aid and mutual assistance from at least one other group. The power elite understand the strategic importance of divide and conquer. A. Curry favor with one ethnic group, such as the Black North End. Alienate, subjugate, and push to the curb the Latino South End. B. Win an election and immediately disenfranchise, disassociate, and subjugate the Black North End. C. Curry favor with the formerly subjugated political group, such as the Spanish-speaking Latino South End. D. Repeat process as long as is necessary to maintain power. Harvard needs an administration that is more concerned about the general well-being of the city and citizens of Hartford than it is in maintaining power for power's sake at the expense of the constituency. If you like being bamboozled, lied to, or played, make sure you do your part to help continue the process. The politics of division, divide and conquer, is alive and well in Hartford. Remember, you have the government that you deserve at all times. Change can only come when you've had enough. My name is J. Stan McCauley, and I do business as Lightsource Productions. I provide professional services in the area of strategic video communications. First, what we do is we help you craft your message using what I call the rule of the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. We do event documentation, content acquisition, full-scale productions, editing, and of course distribution through our social media television network. And with social media, video is more important now than it has ever been. Whether you're talking big business, small business, nonprofit, church, or just an individual. Let's say you plan you're planning an event, a wedding, whatever the case may be. But let's say a big event, but no video. And you spent all this time, all these hours to put this event on, and maybe 100, 200 people attend the event. But more important than that is that thousands could attend by watching it on social media. But of course, you don't think about this until after the event is over. You can't afford not to capture it for social media. And despite what people think, I am affordable. Give me a call. Let's plan your next video project and share it with the world on my social media television network. I promise you that you will have the attention of one person, me.